Well, good day, everyone. We're looking today at American Christianity and its unique features and why it's so different to the European experience and that sort of thing. I want, first of all, take a look back at actually the situation in Europe back around the time of the Reformation. Back in 1517, Martin Luther was a Catholic priest. He had been a Catholic priest for about 10 years at the time, actually. He became a priest in 07. This is 10 years later. He's 34 years of age. And he's unhappy with the practices of the church in a whole range of different areas. The priests are very poorly educated. We have bishops that have control over 3 or 4 dioceses. A lot of the time they're absent. But in particular, Martin Luther is very annoyed, very angry about one issue in particular, and that is the idea of indulgences, because he believes that the church is completely wrong in this regard. It's corrupt. It's just a money-making exercise. And over the next couple of years, he has several debates and several sort of heated discussions with various senior members of the church, bishops and cardinals and people like that. And he finds himself in conflict with the Pope. But eventually he develops a theology that basically suggests that most of the practices of the church, the rituals, most of the sacraments, rosaries, pilgrimages, all this is all totally unnecessary, and he develops a theology sort of unique to himself, actually, and it's sometimes called faith alone. And as he runs into trouble with the church authorities over the next couple of years, in 1520 he writes 3 very notable books, which I actually deal with in a previous video if you'd like to subscribe. But in 1521, just 4 years after he puts up the 95 Theses in 1517, Luther is at a trial. His famous trial is called the Diet of Worms. All the bishops, all the top bishops, princes, and even the emperor of the Roman Empire, Charles V, actually attends. So it's a very important occasion. And when Luther is confronted with the situation about attempting to force him to actually recant on the works and the various books he's written the previous year and the 95 Theses, etc., that he wrote in 1517. He refuses to do so, and he actually elevates Scripture. He says he'll be said by nothing other than Scripture, his reason, his conscience, and Scripture. And he considers Scripture to be superior to all church authority, to the Pope's authority, to church councils. He believes all these things can err, but Scripture is on a higher level. So here we have Martin Luther elevating Scripture to being the supreme authority, and that sounded very heroic at the time, and indeed it was, because to a large extent he risked his life in what he was doing. Although he was protected by the actual local prince, he did have guarantees of safe passage into the trial and away from it, etc. That's a separate story. But about 10 years later, almost 10 years later, Martin Luther finds himself confronted with another great theologian from Switzerland. His name is Zwingli. And basically, they're trying to bring about a common platform for the Reformation movement. And they agree on several issues, about 14 issues, but they have a difference of opinion in relation to the Eucharist. And they simply cannot agree on that, and I go into that in another video as well if you'd like to actually see that. But basically what you have here then is that there's a question mark over the whole doctrine of Scripture alone, in the sense that here we have 2 really great theologians that have put years of their life into studying the Bible, and yet they have 2 different interpretations of what actually the Gospel of John is actually saying in relation to the Eucharist. And of course, if you wind the clock further then up another 40 years or so into the 1560s, and we have various different strands of Calvinism. John Calvin becomes a major theologian in the decades, the 30s and the 40s. And then you have, towards the end of that century, you have a major dispute within the Calvinist movement itself with a great theologian known as Jacob Arminius. And he is a person who is inclined to disagree with the extreme elements of Calvinism, which is based on the doctrine of predestination. And predestination in turn is actually based on Luther's book in 1525, which is called The Bondage of the Will. Essentially what Luther is saying there is that man's free will plays no part whatsoever in salvation. It's all 100% the work of God. Calvin takes that idea further and he claims that that what human beings do in this world has nothing to do with salvation. It's all predetermined. This is known as the doctrine of predestination. However, towards the end of the century, make a long story short, Arminius, who is another great Dutch theologian, he begins to actually question some of this stuff about the idea of people. It's easy to believe that people are born, that it's all decided in advance in relation to people going to heaven. But Arminius was very uncomfortable with the idea of people being born to be condemned. And he basically began to question that towards the end of the century. That was another major development in terms of a split within the Reform movement. So that by the end of the actual century, by about 1618, we have the Synod of Dort, which actually means that the strict Calvinists reject Arminian's theology that there could be an element of free will and that human cooperation could also play a part in salvation. And strict Calvinists actually reject that idea, but it actually still never really goes away because it's basically to do with the idea of that free will, human free will, could play a role in actually salvation. All of these ideas then in relation to Lutheranism, Calvinism and Arminianism, by the end of the first century, the Reformation movement has split into three divisions, broadly speaking. There's other more radical people who are known as Anabaptists who believe that nobody is really a Christian unless they're completely baptized again as adults. But you have these 3 or 4 strands of the Reformation movement that actually want to promote the idea that they all believe that they are 100% right in their perception of the gospel, but they don't agree with each other. And it's this Reformation movement with about 4 different strands that moves across to America in the 1600s and the 1700s. And there are various different doctrines emerge in America. Now the big difference about America and Europe is this. First of all, in Europe for 1500 years, the Pope controlled Christianity in the sense that there was really, apart from the Orthodox Church, which split away after about 1,000 years, but in terms of European Christianity, the papacy controlled, it was the main authority. It was actually the only authority. The Reformation movement actually changed that in that it wasn't that, although Luther said the scripture alone, it almost sounds like everyone can read the Bible and interpret for themselves. That's not really what he meant. What he meant was, and he invited the German nobles, I'll go into this in another video if you'd like to see it, he invited in one of his books in 1520 the German nobles to become part of the Reformation movement and in their own territories to reform the church. And Luther had a sort of a theological idea there that the nobles would come in and do that and help him create the reform that he thought was so necessary. And of course there was a lot of corruption in the church and there was a lot of reform necessary. But the nobles of Europe had a different idea about being invited in. They recognized that 15 or 20% of the land of Europe, especially Germany and England and places like this, was actually owned by the church. So you're talking billions of pounds worth of land. These nobles in Germany and in England, if you want to look at it in detail, you can actually Google it. There's several books written on it as well. But their main motivation actually wasn't so much that they were convinced by Luther's theology. It was more that they were interested in actually achieving a greater level of national independence, a reduction in terms of the actual control that the Roman Empire would have over them and that the Pope would have over them, and a greater level of national independence, and of course, as well as that, greater level of wealth whereby they took over the land that was owned by the church previously. So that by the time all of this package of confusion lands in America, we have a situation where there's no real authority in America. There's no popes, there's no state, there's nobody. It's not like Europe. In Europe they agreed in about about 30 years or so after the Reformation began, in the year 1555 actually, they came up with a treaty or a peace deal called between the states themselves, which was called the Peace of Augsburg. And that basically gave the right to the various different princes and kings and governments of Europe to impose religion onto the people. So it wasn't the people's choice. People that joined the Reform movement, by and large, some of them, of course, where it started initially in Germany, people did have an input into it. But by and large, countries like England and that 30 and 40 years later that joined the Reform movement, actually it was imposed on them by the actual King Henry VIII, and there was a lot of people actually lost their lives in that scenario. But all of this lands in America, where there's no real authority over religion. You don't have popes, you don't have bishops, cardinals, which was the tradition before the Reformation. Then after the Reformation, you had various different states and princes that took over control of religion. But in America, it's a very different experience. There was no state or no church authority to control what was really happening. So these various different European branches of the faith, the Reformation movement is split out into about 4 different movements by the 1600s and 1700s. So these various versions of Christianity arrived in America. And because there was no real authority in terms of kings or princes or bishops or cardinals or anybody like that to control events, the 4 versions of Christianity tended to divide further, because the whole doctrine of actually Scripture alone means that people are entitled to take whatever meaning they want themselves from the Bible. And in America, because of the unique freedom of that country, it actually meant that the entire Christian faith became more diversified. And this is very interesting in that several other branches of the faith then developed in terms of Quakers, in terms of Methodists, in terms of Pentecostals, and at various times then the revival movements and of the 18th and 19th century. You had major characters like Jonathan Edwards. So all these people contributed to a tremendous energy and a tremendous vitality and diversity in the American faith movement. So this is what makes American Christianity today very different to the experience of Europe, which was either controlled by the actual church, the Catholic Church, for 1500 years, or then controlled by various different states in Europe. There's no such controls in America, and as a result you have a huge level of diversification in America, which is very interesting actually. It means that people can join whatever church they want, and there's a lot of competition in the market between the various churches as well, and you have a lot of brilliant preachers either on the television or online giving their particular version of Christianity, and actually they all have a very strong conviction. They're all uniquely convinced that their version of the gospel is the correct one, and that creates a tremendous level of diversity and variety and energy on the one hand. But also it tends to create somewhat division, maybe an element of divisiveness, and in some people's minds confusion as well. So that'll be the downside of the tremendous variety and freedom that actually American Christianity has experienced. There's other various churches as well, and it's tremendous variety and all that, and it's actually a welcome change in a lot of ways to the actual European situation, whereby the states basically took over the role of the church in terms of imposing their own authority. And England is a good example of a situation in that King Henry VIII was never really a person that belonged to the Reformed faith. He wouldn't really have agreed with Luther on a whole range of issues, but he did see a huge advantage in terms of power and money and politics and land in terms of joining the Reform movement. That's a separate story. I do that in another video if you'd like to see it. But what Henry VIII was doing, of course, was he wanted to get out of a marriage, but that was only part of the story. He did manage to put himself in as the head of the church in order to get out of a marriage. And he also actually managed to take over about, somewhere in the region, I'd say, of about 65 to 70 billion pounds worth of land. He took that from the church, actually, divided it among his own loyal nobles. So there was these sort of power reasons, political reasons, wealth reasons. He also managed to stop a whole range of different revenue flows going to Rome, and he asserted English independence. And of course, that would be typical of European states as well. But all these entanglements, of course, led to various different wars within states and between states. And of course, millions of people died. And that's what's so different about the American experience, in that a lot of the people, the founding fathers, actually, as I said in the previous video, actually had this, either they knew about the history of Europe or their direct ancestors came from there, especially from England. And they wanted to actually keep their religion separate from the state. And in doing so, it allowed the whole doctrine of Scripture alone, which was promoted by Martin Luther back at the time of the Reformation, to find a new fertile ground. And actually, this was actually a really interesting experiment in terms of the development of Christianity in America. It was a very unique experiment, and that's what makes American Christianity different, not just to European Christianity, but different to Christianity all over the world in terms of its diversity and variety. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining me, and I intend to do other videos of a similar nature. If you'd like to subscribe, you can see them in the future. Thank you. Goodbye.